us go back in time to 1966. The Beatles' latest song is Yesterday. John F. Kennedy is already dead. Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy are still alive. Gasoline is between 25 and 35 cents a gallon. The Cold War is very much a concern to everyone, while the resistance to the Vietnam War is escalating. We had not yet landed a man on the moon, and we watched Bonanza on Sunday evenings. The internet had not yet appeared. The picture on the cover of your order of service is of me back then. During that year, I was 17 and pretty naive. I didn't even know that pot, grass, Mary Jane, and marijuana are all the same thing. My family and I had moved to Virginia in the year before, and I was miserable. As a liberal gang, I just didn't fit into my high school. LRY on Sunday nights was about the only time I felt okay. My friends were all back in St. Louis, except for my boyfriend, who was in college at Drake University. From my letters, he could tell I was lonely. So in February, Jules hitchhiked over 1,000 miles from Des Moines, Iowa to Richmond, Virginia to visit me. By the time he left, I was pregnant. My mother thought that abortion was the answer. Since that was illegal at the time, the plan was to send me to Mexico or Cuba. When I refused, my mother said, well, we should not ask her to break any more morals, just as if I were not in the room, and implying that I had already broken moral codes by having sex. After several months of feeling alone and dishonored in my own home, I was packed off at the end of my junior year in high school to a home for unwed mothers in Newark, New Jersey. At the same time, my stepfather quit his job in Virginia, got a new one in New Jersey, and the rest of the family moved to Princeton while I was exiled to Newark. This way, there was no one outside the family who would ever know that I was a girl who was sent away. In those days, after World War II and before Roe v. Wade, known as the baby scoop era, a lot of people were moving from working class to middle class. They were threatened by anything outside of the norm, and unwed mothers were one of the biggest threats to their lives. If anyone found out that your daughter was an unwed mother, then the scandal was out, and you could lose your entire place in society. My mother had only married into the upper middle class about a year and a half before. She did not want anything to rock the boat. Suddenly, I had gone from her model child to her worst nightmare, and I had to go away. Before I arrived at the home, I was sure the place would be filled with the worst sort of women. As it turns out, they were all like me. Women who did not have any access to birth control were caught, as it was called back then, and in trouble. The pill had been in use for only a few years, and in 1966 it was still reserved for married women only. Abortion was illegal and very risky. Many women died or were scarred so badly they could never have another child. Even condoms were sometimes hard to get. They were not displayed on pharmacy countertops, but had to be requested. The pharmacist could refuse at his discretion to sell them. This refusal to sell goes back to 1873, when the Comstock Act was passed. The Comstock Law is an anti-obscenity act that specifically lists contraceptives, including condoms, as obscene material, and outlaws the dissemination of them via the Postal Service or interstate commerce. In 1873, the U.S. was the only Western nation to enact laws criminalizing birth control. In the 1950s, 30 states still prohibited the sale of condoms, and in 1966 there were still 13 states. It wasn't to be until 1973 that women would begin having control over their own reproductive systems. It wasn't until the 1980s that women really had full choice about the consequences of having a baby out of wedlock. Interestingly, before World War II, only 1% of infants born out of wedlock were relinquished for adoption outside of their family. During the baby scoop era, 1945 to 1973, 80% were adopted outside their families. And then by the 1980s, it was back down to 1%. There were over 4 million infants relinquished for adoption between 1943 and 1973, and 2 million of these were relinquished in the 60s. This pattern was the same in Canada, Great Britain, New Zealand, and Australia. So here I was at the home, a 3-story brick building with no garden or yard, a step above prison, and certainly not homey. There were probably about 50 of us at any given time, pregnant women and mothers who had just given birth, although we were kept rigidly segregated one group from the other. There were 4 of us to a room, and we each had a mattress on steel springs, a small cupboard near our bed, and a piece of closet in which to hang our clothes. We were given 1 sheet a week, and a piece, so that we could remove the bottom sheet, place the top sheet on the bottom, and then the clean sheet on top in our blanket. We were required to do light chores and attend to all meals in the basement. We could only leave 3 times a week, once for 2 hours, once for 4 hours, and once for 7 hours, and they could not be combined. We had to be escorted by an adult from our families for these outings. If your family did not come, you did not go out. Most of the PGs, as we were called, stayed for 6 weeks to 2 months. I stayed for 4.5 months. I watched a lot of women come in pregnant and leave without their infants. The youngest of these was 11, and the oldest was 22. Some were local, some were from other parts of New Jersey or New York, and a few from over 1,000 miles away. Under the care of the home, we were not given any helpful information. Nothing on what to expect during our pregnancies, on giving birth, on postpartum depression, or the overwhelming grief of having our babies taken away from us a few days after they were born. No counseling of any kind. We were told that we would leave the home and forget all about the experience and our babies, that we were never ever to speak about our pregnancies and our babies to anyone. We were unfit mothers, and our babies were better off without us. We were not told just once, but every day, many times a day, by those who were supposed to be taking care of us, even the cooks. It was hammered into us until we came to believe it. And in such a way, we were coerced into giving up our infants. Because we were told never ever talk about our infants, most people in the country, including the children themselves, came to believe that we did not want our children. In fact, the opposite was so very true. The grief is a lifelong pain that can never be healed. It is not just the crushing loss of our infants at birth, but the pain of never knowing what has become of our offspring. Are they happy, healthy, even still alive? My son was 4 days old when I last saw him. He was beautiful. I had held him, rocked him, fed him, and gazed upon him for 4 days. Then I had to leave him at the hospital. When I got back to the home, I saw the papers for the first time that I would be asked to sign. I knew it was the wrong thing to do. It did not help to know that I had no choice at all. It still felt incredibly wrong to me. As I signed them, something inside me shattered, and that young woman of 17 was buried beneath a mountain of feeling that she would not be able to express for almost 45 years. My stepfather came that evening after he was done with work to drive me home. We did not speak at all as we drove from Newark to Princeton. When I finally got to the family house, all that was said was, "Dinner will be ready in 5 minutes." The silence had begun. I went back to high school right away, and everyone treated me like nothing had happened. The secrecy was working for everyone, except me. I fell into a very deep depression that lasted quite a long time. I thought of my son every single day. There was never any forgetting. And what about the men who fathered these children? Sometimes the infants were a product of rape or incest, and the father never gave a second thought to their cruel actions. Sometimes the mother never told the father. But most of the time, the fathers knew of the pregnancy and were as helpless as the mothers in keeping the infants within their natal family. Here, in the words of the father of my son, are Jules' memories from that time that he recently shared with me. In 1966, I was a lost college student, happy to be away from my parents, but having no idea what to do with my life. I was in love with a girl that my parents didn't approve of, hated college life, but still felt obligated to my parents. Their focus was 100% on their social and economic well-being. After many heated battles with my mother about my girlfriend not being Jewish and the pregnancy, I ultimately did what my mother made me do. I let go of it. And one of the worst parts was that I never went to my loving mentors, my grandparents, for guidance regarding this situation, a situation so important that it changed my life as well as my girlfriend's. I went into a severe depression, began drinking heavily, and then doing more hallucinogenics. It was only a matter of time before I dropped out of school completely. This side of me kept moving from one factory job to another and then to working in bar restaurants, seeking a mindless, easy, cash-based existence. But there was another side of me that always kept my mind working on being a better person. Many years, drugs, girlfriends, and even a first wife later, I began coming back to my basics, to my real family, my grandparents, their old-fashioned views of right and wrong and doing unto others.